By the end of the 1990s, mainstream American horror was moving away from blood and gore. Slick psychological thrillers and teen slashers were more interested in A-list stars than they were blood and guts, and movies like The Sixth Sense and The Blair Witch Project were swinging the pendulum back towards the more ghostly, supernatural end of the horror genre. But this wasn't the case outside of the US. Over in East Asia, Japanese and Korean filmmakers like Takashi Miike and Park Chan-wook were pushing the genre towards increasingly disturbing and extreme levels. Creating some of the most shocking, provocative, and challenging movies in cinema history. Join me as we continue our journey through the mind and body, and we discuss Park Chan-wook's Oldboy and Takashi Miike's Audition. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 6th series exploring the mind and body in horror cinema, and this is part 22. This episode is sponsored by $20 patron Katie Dyer, and in this episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be exploring 2 East Asian classics from the turn of the millennium: Takashi Miike's Audition from 1999 and Park Chan-wook's Oldboy from 2003. Both these movies will be spoilerific reviews, and if you haven't seen them, please go away and watch them before listening to our reviews, because both these movies have 2 of the most incredible, gobsmacking final acts in the history of cinema, and you really don't want to be spoiled on them before you experience them. So please go away and give them a watch before listening to our discussion. So before we get started, just wanted to share with you guys an exciting opportunity for listeners of the pod. Now, a friend of the pod, Adam Robinson, who I'm sure many of you will know of, as well as being on this podcast a bunch of times, he's also an actor, director, and writer, and he writes and performs his own live ghost stories, which he performs in theatres around the country. I've seen a few of his shows now, and he is wonderful, and his stories are incredible and incredibly creepy as well. If you're a fan of that kind of classic English Christmas ghost story, then you do not want to miss out on this opportunity. This Christmas, for 4 nights from the 19th of December to the 23rd, he is bringing us A Christmas Carol, the festive audio experience. So this is the classic A Christmas Carol, but it's been adapted by Adam Robinson. And I think this particular sort of audio version of this well-loved tale is going to tease out the gothic and ghostly aspects of this remarkable story, telling us a Dickens classic as we've never heard it before. So if you want to check that out, then we've been offered a very special discount code. If you head over to the Harrogate Theatre website, that's harrogatetheatre.co.uk, you can enter the promo code EVOLUTION and you will get a very special discount. So one more time, head on over to the harrogatetheatre.co.uk. Performances of A Christmas Carol, the festive audio experience that run from the 19th to the 23rd of December, and get yourself a discount. Promo code EVOLUTION. And I will, of course, list all of the details to this in the show notes. Okay, let's get on with this week's episode then. Joining me to discuss all things Audition and Oldboy, we've got a long-time friend of the pod with us this week. He was first here on the podcast discussing zombies with me a couple of seasons back. He's a writer and critic for Total Film, as well as a whole bunch of other places. And it's so great to have him back. Welcome back to the podcast, Tim Coleman. Hello.
Hello, sir. How are you?
I am very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, man. I'm all right.
I'm, at the moment, obviously, we're talking on Zoom, and I'm currently just admiring your DVD collection behind you. That's a pretty good selection you got there.
Yeah, I'm probably the same for a lot of your listeners. If you're a big film fan, physical media cannot be replaced by streaming services. As much as I love streaming services, there are things which cannot be replicated in the same way. So,
isn't it ridiculous though? I don't know if you get this. I find that I'm the same. I am always, if I love a film, I will always buy it and I will keep the physical media. But then, if it's on a streaming service, I'll probably watch it on a streaming service just so I don't have to bother actually getting it off a shelf and putting a DVD or a Blu-ray in,
That is absolutely true. Although you then get like the bonus features, of course, on physical media.
Yes.
So like if you want to go a little bit deeper into some of your favourite titles,
yes,
can't be replicated.
Absolutely. So last time you were here, it feels like a while ago now. Last time you were here, we were talking about zombies, weren't we? Way back at the beginning of our zombie series. Let me ask you a little bit about this this sort of theme or subgenre or whatever you want to call it that we've been kind of exploring this year, the mind and the body, movies that deal very much kind of from the deal with the horrors from within, I suppose. What are your thoughts about these types of movies, this kind of area of the genre?
So I think actually when you and I last spoke for zombies, I think I said at the time like zombies and body horror are like my two favorite subgenres of horror. And I think because you're framing this series in terms of it being the body and the mind, and I think part of because you and I had some preliminary discussions when you were thinking about the season like a couple of years or a year and a half ago, and I think you were originally playing with the idea of it being the body, mind, and the spirit.
Yes,
and that kind of the kind of idea of like posing some of those psychological, philosophical questions alongside the kind of tactile reality of the body. And I think I love all that stuff. And certainly when you publish the list of films that you're covering this season, I mean, this might make me sound a little bit emotionally fragile, but I mean, it's 2020, so I think everyone's been a little bit emotionally
yeah, we're at
fragile.
that place. That's fine.
But yeah, just real talk. Yeah. But I welled up a little bit when I looked at it because there were so many films that you're covering this season, which means so much to me. Things like Cronenberg's The Fly, Eraserhead, right through to one that we're doing today, through to like Pascal Augier's Martyrs. And I think for me, like these are films that aren't just good films, but they just have so much personal meaning and have shaped me as a person. And I think that's probably not an uncommon reaction. I don't think. I think that there are so many classics being dealt with this season. I think I would be remiss to say anything other than I absolutely. For me, this is like pure horror cinema. This is the stuff. This is the really good stuff. And
well, me too. And I'm really glad actually that quite a lot of people have had that same reaction because I considered this a very sort of personal list to myself. I mean, like a couple of people have said to me, like, did you basically just like create this strand so you could talk about David Lynch? And partly, yes, that is true. Yeah. But everything that we're talking about, every single movie is so fascinating in its own way. And I think what's really interesting, maybe in comparison to something like zombie films or slashers, which are brilliant and also have their place, these movies often lie on the cusp of the genre, maybe in the margins of the genre. They're less firmly placed in horror, but that in itself I think always sort of provokes quite interesting discussions, right, as to sort of where we place these films. Absolutely.
The whole idea of genre, however, is arguably a little bit reductive because it's about trying to get films to fit into, and I'm not dissing it, like I think it's a useful construct because we get to then group films in our minds, so we find other things that we like, so you can say, oh, I like this, or what else is like this. But I think, some of the very best films, not just in horror, but in cinema, play with genre in a really interesting way and really subversive way, and are quite transgressive. certainly the ones we're speaking about today do that, where they mess around with genre in ways which has upset some people, and certainly makes classification of what they actually are a little bit difficult. But for me, that only just heightens their quality. It kind of interrogates the kind of generic constraints of the medium, and I'm all for that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I'm really excited to talk about these two movies this week. We are in this kind of really interesting era where around about the turn of the millennium, and I don't know if you actually remember this specifically, Tim, as a sort of film lover at the time, because I certainly found that the more interesting genre films that I was finding at this point were outside of the kind of the US UK kind of mainstream. This was the rise of new French extremity and also J horror and this really fascinating stuff happening kind of elsewhere, right? And this week we're particularly talking about Asian horror, a Korean and a Japanese movie. So let me ask you, I mean, I know it's a very broad question, but are you a fan of Asian genre cinema, and particularly this kind of what felt like a bit of a wave of it at this point in time, right?
No, absolutely. I remember, so I am of an age where I was kind of turning 18 at the end of the 90s, which is like kind of a crazy good time to be a genre fan, because we had the Scream movies, so I was able to see like some of those at the pictures. We had James Furman step down from the BBFC, which, with no disrespect to James Furman, him stepping down kind of facilitated the re-release of films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre theatrically. So I saw like that, The Exorcist, for example, at the cinema for the first time. But yeah, for Asian horror films, I remember, because we're kind of not quite pre-internet back then, but like, certainly the internet wasn't what it is today. And so you would get like these kind of whispers and these hypes of like incoming titles through magazines and television shows and whatnot. And I remember I pre-ordered a DVD copy of Hideo Nakata's Ring, not really knowing anything about it, but just knowing it was about a cursed tape. And it just arrived, and I watched it, and it just scared the absolute whatsits off me. I remember, not even just the watching it. I remember it was like because of course the conceit of that film is 7 days later it's going to get you.
Yeah.
So I remember lying in my bed like 7 days later, staring at my TV, not being able to go to sleep until I'd passed the 7 day timestamp.
Amazing.
And then I went to university shortly after, saw like Battle Royale, for example, at the student cinema, and those titles, well, particularly Ring, made a big impression. Just in latter years. We're going to be talking today about Takashi Miike's Audition, which I actually came to quite a lot later than that. Surprisingly, I didn't see it at the time, but that has since become one of my favorite films of all time.
Amazing. And that is an interesting film to talk about in comparison to Ring in a way, isn't it? Because it was sort of a different vibe to maybe what you'd call your traditional J-horror, right? I mean, we talked about a lot of J-horror films on this podcast in our Ghost Stories series, much more kind of folk horror-y, ghost stories, folklore, that kind of stuff. Then there is this other side to Asian cinema, and actually, we are big fans of physical media. I'm sure both of us, as so many people remember very fondly, those Tartan Asia extreme movies, right, from back in the day, and how good they all were. But they did have that word extreme associated with them.
No, absolutely. I mean, the Tartan Extreme label is a really interesting one. It was Tartan Films was headed up by a guy called Hamish McAlpine, and back in the late 90s, there's this account where Hamish was apparently he watched over the course of one weekend Ring and then Miike's Audition, almost back to back. And he was so blown away by those titles that he kind of created Tartan Extreme as a way of kind of grouping them together and kind of acknowledging what Pan-Asian cinema was doing at that time. And just actually there was a whole body of work out there, which he felt he could kind of package together and then distribute to the West. And so essentially he created that label of Tartan Extreme, but it did become like an implicit endorsement because predominantly because of those two films, and then Battle Royale shortly afterwards, where you knew in kind of a similar way, I guess, that Arrow Video is nowadays, that if you see an Arrow Video title, you kind of have a sense about what it's going to be.
Yes.
With Tartan Extreme, it was like an implicit endorsement about, almost like it was like a generic classification for itself.
Yes.
And yeah, certainly like things like Ring, Audition, and Battle Royale, if you want to take those three, we hadn't seen anything like that in Western cinema, not really. And it's invigorating. Because you think you know what horror cinema is, and then something comes along and just absolutely slaps you around the face.
Totally. They blew my mind, changed my life. Probably those films. I mean, Battle Royale. We're not really talking about it in this series, but my God, what an incredible, breathtaking film that is. Still to this day, I love that film. It gives me goosebumps. It's just wonderful.
I mean, this is the thing as well. Like, these films are all like 20 plus years old, and we're still talking about them. And actually, we're recording this in 2020. This is the year that Parasite won Best Picture at the Oscars, and directed by Bong Joon-ho. Like, not that director Boon was kind of involved in those films particularly, but obviously as a Korean filmmaker, he kind of came up at the same time as Park Chan-wook and Takashi Miike and there's other Pan-Asian directors. And so it's we're still feeling the legacy of that kind of cultural movement, and obviously like Park Chan-wook in particular has pushed further into the mainstream with things like The Handmaiden from a few years ago. So it's really seismic influence.
So I mean, that's it, and I still love revisiting these films. So with that in mind, then let's begin. Let's start talking about Audition from 1999.
So the best version of the synopses I've ever heard was from the Tartan DVD liner notes, and I gave away my Tartan DVD a little while ago. So when I kind of upgraded to the Arrow Blu-ray, so I'm afraid I can't check the exact wording, but it was something to the effect of it's a romantic comedy or a romantic drama for about halfway, and at the midpoint it descends into hell, which for me is a cracking. And obviously this goes without saying that people who are listening to this should not listen any further without having watched the film, because part of Audition and indeed Oldboy is part of the ride is the way the third acts of both of those films hit you. I mean, if we were going to do a more detailed synopsis, it's essentially the story. Audition is the story of a middle-aged widower, and apologies for my Japanese pronunciation, Shigeharu Aoyama. And he lost his wife 7 years ago and has been raising their son. But when his son becomes a teenager, he starts teasing his dad that he should perhaps remarry. And it sends Aoyama on a trajectory of trying to meet the right woman with horrifying results.
Indeed. These films, like you just mentioned, it's so important to go away and watch these films before listening to this discussion, because I don't know about you, but I think most people probably always remember the first time watching Audition. Probably the same with Oldboy as well. The wallop around the face that is the experience of watching this film for the first time, and the thrill of not knowing what you're watching and where it's going. So let me ask you, to start with a simple question, Tim, what do you think of this film? Now, you've already alluded to this slightly. You said it's one of your all-time favourites. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably it's definitely in my top 10. It might be in my top 5. And I think Audition is nothing if not divisive. When it first came out, people were equally enraptured by it as I am. But there were people who really hated it, like when the film had its premiere in the Rotterdam Film Festival, which is like the first major Western screening of that film. Miike was present, and apparently after the movie, a woman walked past him and literally hissed at him and said, "You are sick," which Miike of course loved because he's a provocative sensationalist, but yeah, I mean, it's a film that's been labelled as being both pro-feminism and also misogynist. Like, my take on it is a deeply empathetic, pro-human film. I think it actually navigates a very delicate balance between empathy for both of its key characters, and I think that's where its strength is. It because we're talking about it as we go in terms of the portrayal of particularly of Asami as the love interest that Aoyama falls for, but I think Miike, and like considering how, if you compare the rest of Audition to the rest of his films, and I don't pretend to have seen all of them. The man's got something in the region of, I think, 106 directorial credits to his name. But if you look at some of his more famous titles, so things like Ichi the Killer, or Visitor Q, or Happiness of the Katakuris, or Gozu, these films are absolutely insane. and absolutely bombastic, and I mean, if you think Audition's hard going, I would challenge somebody to watch Visitor Q without grimacing like suddenly for 90 minutes. But yeah, so Audition though is full of empathy, I think, for its key characters, and for me, like, I think it's almost like a magic trick watching Miike pull that off. And so, yeah, I just love it very, very deeply. It's a very special film for me.
Me too. And that brilliant thing, because I know it's something, you mentioned it in that brief synopsis. We all talk about it as this brilliant film that gives you this sort of what begins as a rom-com slowly descends into hell. And I'm always so impressed at how gradual and organic that slow descent into hell happens. It's not like a shower scene in Psycho moment where we switch narrative and we switch genres. It's like this, suddenly you don't realise it, that what you're watching is suddenly making you kind of break out in a cold sweat, and all of a sudden everything has changed. Like you say, like a magic trick. It somehow happened very naturally and gradually and organically, all within a very short running time, right? It's really impressive.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think there's something so deft in the way the whole premise is set up. I mean, I probably should expand on that synopsis to say that when Aoyama decides he wants to meet a potential wife, he realizes he doesn't know how to meet women. So he sits down with an advertising film executive friend of his called Yoshikawa, who proposes that they hold a fake audition. And essentially, the women will be applying for what they believe is an actress position, but really they're using it as a platform for screening for potential brides. Now, if you take a step back from it, that's clearly a very toxic male privilege thing to do, completely unacceptable, and particularly in a post-Weinstein world as we are now. Like, I actually, this is probably another reason I love this film so much, is I saw it comparatively not that long ago for the first time, about 3 years or so. And it was when Weinstein, he was at the beginning of his downfall. The allegations which have since led to his conviction were very much in the public eye, along with Me Too and Time's Up. And like part of where I was at the time was thinking, well, like, how do I, as a man, engage with this as a feminist ally? Because it's easy enough for a guy to say, well, I personally am not a rapist. I personally am not a predator. But the reality is, like, Weinstein was able to commit the crimes he committed because of a toxic culture of male privilege that goes unquestioned. And if you're kind of, as a man, if you're silent about that, you end up being complicit in it. And so then I watched Audition, and the whole premise of it, setting up this fake audition, is essentially about toxic male privilege. It's about, like, Aoyama is able to do that because he's a man and because of his connections. I mean, going back to the original point about the kind of magic trick element of it, the bit that's so clever in that opening act where Aoyama is and Yoshikawa are kind of contriving this audition, is that in someone else's hands that could be played as like a romantic comedy setup. As in, like, if you framed it a bit differently, of course, it's obviously still really toxic, but you could play it a little bit as, oh, isn't it sweet? He doesn't know how to meet girls. He just wants to kind of meet the right person, But like Miike kind of holds that in one hand, and then in the other hand, there's this kind of low thrumming undercurrent of acknowledgement about how toxic it is. It's and it holds it both. Like the music is really jaunty, it's really romantic. There's a lot of melodramatic, stuff happening. But at the same time, there's this kind of just like almost like a sub-audio like hum. Like the way in Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, where he uses frequencies that you can't hear. It just makes you feel sick. It's like, similarly like on like a moral level, Miike kind of has this thread where you're like, the construct of the film is saying this, but there is something really dark and evil that's just thrumming under the surface, and I think right from the beginning that undercurrent is there.
Yeah, I agree, and I do think, and I know everyone always loves to hear two dudes talk about what is and isn't misogynist, but I do think you're right, and I think it is. I would say that it's quite obviously. From my perspective, portraying these men, particularly the friend, maybe as misogynist. The way that they're set up at the beginning, where they're in the restaurant and they kind of they get annoyed at the women sort of laughing too loudly and call them shrill and stuff, and the way they interact and talk about how, I've got to find myself a new wife. I don't know, everything about it feels very old-fashioned in a kind of really uncomfortable kind of way, doesn't it? And again, I feel like that's all very deliberate. I feel like the film is not necessarily landing on their side, right? And it's something we've talked about. Actually, funnily enough, something we've been talking about over on Patreon with Irreversible and Gaspar Noé. But it's that idea of, are you making a film about misogyny, or are you just a misogynist film? And I know that's a very tricky thing sometimes to navigate. But I do think that, like you say, the film is kind of undercutting what it's showing with a kind of mood and a tone. There's just incredible tone management, I suppose, throughout this whole film, isn't there? Which goes back to what we were saying about the way in which it changes as it goes. Yeah, no,
I completely agree. Obviously, as you say, it all comes with the caveat that, we are two guys, and so we're giving just a very particular perspective on it. I think if you go like back, so at the very beginning of the film, you have that scene where Aoyama's wife Ryoko passes away. She dies from, I believe, cancer in hospital. Yeah. He takes his son off, and we get a flash forward saying 7 years later. And I think the first scene after that is him and his son are fishing, and they're even making jokes about, I'm catching fish, and comparing the act of hunting or fishing to catching women.
Yeah, there is already kind of literally a sort of predatory sort of subtext going on there, right? In that,
but like if you don't have to cast your mind too far back, and that kind of stuff was fairly common in the way people speak, like the whole like scouting for girls stuff,
Yes,
But what Miike does is then he does like undercut it with this real thread of loneliness, which so when Aoyama's son first suggests to him you should remarry, it's a beautifully framed scene at the dinner table, and everyone else leaves the room, and it just leaves Aoyama alone at the table, and it's almost like something out of an Ozu movie where you've got like the isolation of him in the frame and this sense of just deep existential loneliness. And in fact, I think in one of those early scenes, somebody even says like everybody in Japan is lonely. Mm-hmm. And so there you can, on the one hand, look at him and go, he's a bit of a dinosaur in his values, and the way he's talking about women is unacceptable. However, he's also like a deeply lonely person who's kind of, without minimizing any of the stuff that he said, there is a sense of him just being a very isolated and sad man.
Yes,
who maybe has been left behind a little bit.
So we then get to this audition sequence, and we do meet the character of Asami. The ultimate kind of sweet, timid, quote unquote kind of perfect good girl, I suppose, in so many ways, and she's kind of exactly what he's looking for. What do you think of the character of Asami and sort of the way that she's introduced?
I think it's so fascinating because the way she's introduced is through the perception of Aoyama. He already kind of semi-decides that he's falling in love with her even before the audition.
Yes.
He gets the application forms from all the actresses, and essentially he's going about it, of course, in a very commodified way. He's got a list in his head about what he wants from a potential wife, and it's it's almost like he's shopping for a car. Almost, I think is one of the like he wants her to be cultured, and and he then sees Asami, and she kind of seems to fulfill a lot of those things he's looking for. The audition itself, then, before we meet Asami, we go through a montage of a bunch of other applicants as well, and you mentioned before about Yoshikawa as the friend being a bit worse than Aoyama, and I think that's absolutely borne out in the audition sequence, because Yoshikawa is asking all these really inappropriate questions of the girls, like things about have you ever worked in the sex industry, what kind of men are you into, would you do sex scenes, and very like in a kind of post-Weinstein word, very sleazy, whilst Aoyama is a bit more aware and actually a bit more reserved. Like he says, I feel like a criminal. He's kind of aware that he's doing something a bit wrong, and even at 1 minute one of the applicants starts to undress for them, and Yoshikawa is loving it, and Aoyama is like averting his eyes because he's just embarrassed by the whole thing. Like he might be holding some outdated views, but he's not there just to kind of see the actresses get undressed for him. Exactly, yeah. So, which is another interesting point, considering what happens at the end of the film. Like, he's not the worst example of a toxic man. Like, his views are quite privileged and outmoded and outdated, but he's not a predator. He's not like a sleazy guy in quite the same way as Yoshikawa is. Yeah,
he's almost, because I mean, even throughout the film, he's never the instigator of, the first time that he and Asami have sex, it's her, right, that kind of instigates it and everything. And he's actually, he's exactly like you said, he may be old-fashioned in his views, but actually he's not necessarily leery himself, is he, in that way, which is interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And I think Audition is based on a novel by a guy called Murakami, who, in the novel, it's quite clear as well that Aoyama has a sex life. He still like dates women, and so he's not looking for a wife, so he's not looking just for someone to have sex with. He's looking for an intimate life partner. He's looking for love. He's going about it in a very bad way, but he's not just trying to take advantage of somebody. He's trying to find the right person for him. And so then Asami comes in, and actually when she enters the room for the audition, the camera is sitting behind her, facing Aoyama. So what you're getting really is his reaction to seeing her.
Yes,
she's sitting there. She's all in white. So she's kind of, coded as this kind of virginal, perfect woman. Aoyama's completely infatuated with her. But what you do get the sense, because of the way that shot is framed, is you're getting what he's projecting onto her. She's like literally like a blank canvas.
Yeah.
And he's projecting his desire and his belief about her being a perfect woman onto her. And she's there almost like a blank slate, with her voice is really quiet. There's something deeply uncanny about it, to be honest, because all the jaunty melodramatic music cuts out. There's no flashy editing, no music, and the audition happens. And actually afterwards, it's Yoshikawa who says to Aoyama, "She makes me nervous. I mean, I feel anxious. There's something wrong with her." So it's really interesting. Again, like Yoshikawa might be a really sleazy, toxic bro, but he is a bit more turned on to the potential risks that Asami might pose, because he looks at her and goes, there's something not quite right about her. Well, Aoyama, who perhaps is a bit, he's not as sleazy, but he's just like blinded by love at this point. He kind of doesn't really see Asami clearly. He's just projecting a bunch of his own desires onto her.
Absolutely, because she is on paper, literally on paper, because he's read her form, the perfect woman for him, right? And he kind of, like you said, can't really see beyond that. It's really interesting. And I think you're absolutely right in the way that audition sequence itself. I mean, the title's called Audition, right? So it is a key scene, that whole audition scene. And I think it is very clever, the decisions that Miike makes with how he kind of directs that particular scene and who we're aligned with. So the film kind of continues in this vein of this kind of sweet, these two quite sweet, quite sad people getting to know each other. And I think there's also something that he's quite drawn to her sadness, I think, too. Like, the more she tells him about her quite tragic life and her injury and all of these different things, he seems to like that even more, doesn't he, in a way, that this is another human being that has that kind of sadness in her heart.
Yeah, I mean, because he has lost his wife at a relatively young age, and so he's carrying this grief with him. He's had to kind of carry on because they had a young son who he's had to raise ostensibly on his own. There's this idea that he's kind of put his own life on hold and sublimated his own grief. And so when she talks a little bit, I think in her application form, about having to have given up ballet because of an injury, and he kind of identifies with that sense of loss. And so on that kind of psychological level, he just connects with her.
Yeah.
Which again kind of goes back to, like, he's not just trying to bed her. He's actually looking for somebody he can have a meaningful human connection with, which is really interesting.
And so then it's not long though before we get this scene when he's calling her. Now, recently on Patreon we did a scariest ever moments as voted for by the patrons, and it was an incredible list of 50 moments, and there was very, very few films. There's a handful of films that actually had more than one moment per film, and The Shining was one, and The Exorcist, the kind of films you'd imagine. And then Audition was another one of those films that actually had two specific scenes that people said were two of the scariest moments in cinema history. And I couldn't agree more. And the first one is coming up, which is, I guess, the first big red light, right? That something is seriously wrong, which is Asami waiting by the phone, waiting for it to ring, waiting. And then the phone finally ringing, and the sack, the terrifying jump scare, the movement of the sack. Tim, talk us through this incredible scene.
It's beautiful, isn't it? As a bit of composition, because you have the sense that something is slightly off with Asami. There's something a bit uncanny about the situation. I mean, obviously there's the the stuff that Shikaru Aoyama's doing, but there's also something a bit off with her. And like the first time then you see Asami sitting down, she's sitting in a slightly odd posture, as if her bones are not quite put together properly. And she's staring at the phone. There's this sack on the floor. And it's kind of intercut with with an image of Ryoko, who's Shikaru's Aoyama's first wife. And she disappears behind a tree.
Yes.
And the sense of, like, the memory of this old wife is being kind of erased, or like almost like her ghost is looking on mournfully about what's about to happen.
Yes.
And then you get the second call, and Shikaru Aoyama has been kind of like, oh, should I call her? Should I not call her? And he eventually caves and he does call her, and the phone rings, and Asami smiles, and then there's this insane bit of sound design where this like guttural, vomity growl comes out of the bag, and it just rolls across the floor.
It's nightmare fodder. It's both kind of incredibly subtle and uncanny, but it's also just like a classic horror jump scare at the same time. It's just it's so wonderful, and it gets me every single time. And like you say, it's about that composition, it's about the weight, the pacing, and it's also not knowing what the hell is happening at this point as well, and who the hell's in the sack and what's going on. And then this is that turning point. This is when things start getting kind of weirder and weirder. How do you? I mean, we've touched upon it briefly already, but how do you find it? This then sort of slow transition as the, I guess, what starts as a romance then becomes this kind of mystery, doesn't it? Before we get into the full horror, it's a kind of mystery uncovering where our main character is kind of trying to investigate, trying to figure out what's really going on with Asami, and he's going to talk to people like the man that worked at the bar where she claimed to occasionally do shifts with her friend and this kind of stuff, and he's slowly kind of uncovering her past. What do you think of that and the way that this kind of story slowly unravels? Yeah, no,
I love it. There's this sense of just like water slowly boiling around you, and there's already been like these kind of, there's obviously that scene with the sack, but like that's something that the audience is privy to, which Shikaru Aoyama isn't. That's something that we see with like kind of an omniscient information. But there have been other clues, like for example, I think she puts down a reference on her essay, and this guy, they go looking for him, and he's missing. They can't confirm anything about her, and Yoshikawa again is like kind of being the voice of reason to his friend and saying, look, we don't know anything about this woman, like, and Aoyama's not listening to her. He's just like, I'm just going to ask her to marry me. He goes straight there. And Yoshikawa's like, you can't think straight, you're in love, you're not thinking straight. And it kind of goes around about the halfway point, and this is where this is probably like the halfway point where the descent into hell properly kicks off, I would say, is where they go on like a weekend away together. And it seems, again, like it could be like really romantic. Like they go down to this nice little place by the sea. But again, like some of the composition here is so beautiful. So like, art house, it could be in like a Bergman movie where you've got Asami standing in the window looking at the ocean, and you've got all this kind of imagery about, of course, like, associating her with the ocean is like to do with her femininity, potentially with like the tides and menstrual cycle, but also like, the moon is moon and tides can be a sign of like lunacy, in ancient times. So that's all kind of like brooding along. She undresses to sleep with him. And she's got these scars on her leg, which we haven't seen before. And I think she talks about it being an accident. And they then sleep together, but not before she says to him, "Will you love me and no one else?" Yeah. And he says, yes, of course I will. Because in his head, he's thinking, I'm not going to mess around on you. I'm not going to cheat on someone. I just want to love you. And as we come forward, we realize that actually she means it a bit more literally than that.
Literally no one else. Exactly. This is where we go a bit, fatal attraction or something, isn't it, at this point, or misery. It's like, it's not far off. Tonally, it couldn't be more different, but kind of structurally, it's going in that direction at this point, right? And it just starts then getting darker and more twisted and more confusing and nightmarish as the more like nuggets of information that we hear, right? When he goes to the dance studio, first of all, right, and he finds this man who has no feet. He's got prosthetic feet, and has a kind of very strange conversation with this very, very creepy man that was her dance teacher. Then he goes to that bar, and the barman kind of just casually tells him this story about this woman who worked at the bar who was murdered and dismembered, and they found her tongue, and they found an extra tongue, and whatever it was. These like strange little moments of like, again, more and more alarm bells ringing, but at this point we're still not able to completely kind of put together all the pieces, right? But I just think it's I love it, and there is something that feels very Lynchian about this particular kind of second half of the film, and the way in which suddenly, as the story gets more nightmarish, the actual form of the film starts to unravel, doesn't it? Suddenly chronology starts getting confusing, and we don't know whether we're in flashbacks or dream sequences or in the sort of present day reality of what's really going on. And our main character himself is kind of finding himself sort of flashing in and out of, that moment when he's in the bar and he's told about the murder and the dismembered, bits of body parts. Suddenly he sees that horrific shot of that tongue kind of flapping on the floor, and then he reacts to it as if he's actually seen it, and it's all of a sudden the filmmaking starts becoming untrustworthy, doesn't it, in a really kind of clever way, which I love.
Texturally, the film just takes on a very different tone. Like the lighting when he goes to the ballet school is like golden, almost as if he's walking through like a virtual, like a kind of alternative reality almost. And you're right, like not only is this creepy guy there, he hasn't got any feet, he kind of makes these kind of weird comments. I think he says to Aoyama, "Did you smell her?" And like there's this really seedy like implication of like sexual abuse there. And like you said, the uncanny images, they talk about the person who was chopped up in that bar, and they say there were 3 extra fingers and a tongue.
That's it.
And you're like,
oh my god, yeah.
And then there he goes home and he thinks, I just don't know where she is, and he pours himself a glass of whiskey, and that is where it really goes south. So like after he goes to the bar and like he's tried to find her, he goes home, he's just like, he's stressed, he's lovesick, he's wondering where she is. There's a POV shot of somebody breaking into his house, which we later realize is Asami. He sits down, he drinks a glass of whiskey, and then he suddenly collapses onto the floor, and it's implied heavily that he's been drugged. And again, like in Murakami's novel, like it's heavily implied that he's drugged in the hotel room, which is how she was able to escape from the room without him finding out. And basically, he's been drugged, and we then have a really protracted torture scene that more or less goes on for around about 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes. Like again, in the novel, the torture scene is really truncated. It's kind of snipped to around about maybe an eighth of the book at the very end as a coda. And like Miike just says, nope, we're going to make that more or less a solid third of the film. But it's not just the physicality of his torture. It's like as those drugs are coursing through his system, and as she starts to inflict, and we can go through the specifics of it because I think not just to be lurid, but because I think it's interesting. The harm she commits to him is kind of quite symbolically important. But his brain almost like starts to collapse under the trauma, and he goes off onto these. It's like he's almost phasing in and out of consciousness and having these kind of, are they dream sequences? Is he kind of receiving some kind of revelation about what's actually happening, or is it kind of his paranoid fantasies that he's projecting? And basically what is real and what is happening becomes very, very unstable. But you do get these kind of dreamlike Lynchian tableaus about different moments which start to perhaps piece together information about maybe who Asami is and what's been happening.
I mean, let's talk about these scenes of torture then, some of the most iconic moments from this film, right? And actually very soon we're about to start talking about French extremity and scenes of torture and how torture is handled in that, and then we're also going to be talking about what people label torture porn and movies from Eli Roth and people like that. But let me ask you, how do you find it in Audition? How do you think these scenes of torture are handled? How squeamish do you find it? How effective do you find it?
So I am personally quite a big fan of extreme films. I think with the caveat that I think they can be used to make really profound points.
Yes.
And so like one of the things, like when I was reading around the topic of extreme Asian films, there were a few different definitions about what makes an extreme Asian film or an extreme film. And it's not just the extremity of the violence, it's the extremity of the politics, and it's the extremity of the emotional impact. And so it's worth saying that like the physicality that Aoyama suffers is preceded by these kind of staccato dream sequences which are very emotional. Like we go back to the scenes of his dates with Asami, but it's got different dialogue where she kind of discloses being abused. He fantasizes that he sees his first wife Ryoko warning him at the table, at the table in restaurant, saying, "Be careful." He then, in his mind, he goes to Asami's flat, and she goes down on him, but then he looks down and it's the girlfriend of his son.
Yes.
And then he trips over the sack and this guy falls out of the sack and his fingers and feet and tongue and ears are missing. And Asami comes in and vomits in a bowl and tries to feed it to the guy. And then Asami
is one of the most unbearable moments for me. Feeding the vomit. Oh, it's too far.
It's not good. And then but even then it doesn't stop, because then it cuts, like Asami then transforms into a child, and it's the child version of Asami, and then that cuts back to like some stuff about her being molested and burnt by her ballet teacher, and all this stuff then happens in very quick succession before we get to Aoyama being tortured. And what you're left is this very disorientating feeling that actually Asami is someone who has suffered at the hands of men, and actually Aoyama is somebody who has perhaps transgressed more than he's willing to admit. Like there's a little subplot which is touched on very lightly about how he slept with a co-worker.
Yes.
And she appears to have been quite hurt by that. And to him it was nothing. And so he's been quite casual in how he's apparently cast her off. But that's been quite a damaging experience for her. And so you kind of end up with this very disorientating, nightmarish feeling about male privilege has really hurt, and really not even male privilege, just male abuse has hurt Asami, and to some extent Aoyama has been complicit in the kinds of behavior which had hurt Asami. Like not that he was a predator, not that he was a pedophile, but that he still acted reprehensibly, and his behavior was still not okay. And it's only then that we come back to the torture.
Yes.
So, sorry to kind of like you asked me the specific question about the physicality of it, but I feel that contextual information kind of sets it up because it's what makes what happens next so much more emotional. So you cut from all those like very bizarre dream sequences, and then Asami injects his tongue with something, starts pulling his clothes off and taking his clothes off. And as she's doing that, she's talking to him and saying, I'm doing this basically because of the audition, because you men are all the same. And interestingly here, she falsely accuses him of saying, you only do the audition to get girls that you can sleep with. Because that's how she sees the situation. But we know that that's not really it. Like, he doesn't want to just sleep with her. He is, in his own broken, toxic way, he's looking for love.
Yes.
But she thinks, no, you're a predator. So already there's that like, oh, he's done some bad stuff, but is it bad enough to warrant what's coming to him?
Yeah, to be penetrated over and over and over again, right?
Exactly this, because like, she literally straddles him.
Yeah.
And effectively, I mean, she basically gets acupuncture needles and starts to insert them into his face, eye sockets, and stomach. It's essentially an inverted rape because it's almost like you wanted to penetrate me, I'm going to penetrate you. Yeah. And of course she says Kiri 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 while she does that. And, it's like, again, like a very chilling sound in a very sing-song voice. Which,
yes, meaning deeper, right? Deeper, deeper, deeper.
Yeah, it's got a few different meanings because I thought it was deeper, deeper, deeper. That's one take. Apparently, it's the most literal translation is it's an onomatopoeic Japanese word for cut, cut, cut.
Interesting. Okay.
But you could also take it as deeper, 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 or tickle, tickle, tickle. So, all of which are bad. And I think like what I really like about it is to kind of, if I can bring out like a sociological counselling model for a second, because like my background is, as well as being a film journo, I kind of teach social work at a university, and so we do like different kind of theoretical models for stuff. And I think there's a really interesting model called Transactional Analysis, which is to do with power and relationships. So essentially analysing the transactions between people. And like the headlines of it are that people operate on 3 levels of power. Like we either operate as children, as adults, or as parents. And there are like some subcategories within that, but like that's kind of it in broad strokes. And the idea is that on a healthy relationship, like two adults would speak to each other as adult to adult, but that we've learned stuff in childhood or stuff has happened to us in childhood. That means that we have ingrained conflict responses, so that if we feel threatened or we feel like we're losing power in a relationship, we might have some unhealthy behaviors that we bring out. So like you might start shouting to try and regain power in a relationship, in which case you're kind of going up into parent mode, or you might go very quiet and go down in like submissive child mode. What I think you can get here, applying that to Asami here, is that all this while she's been projecting or playing along with a submissive child mode. And it's almost like in this moment she's going, no, I am now taking all the power back. You literally cannot move, and I am going to do to you as I absolutely wish. And like, because the fact that she kind of, goes into his eyes as well, it's like she's literally trying to destroy the male gaze. It's like, you looked at me this way, you did this to me, I am going to, not quite pop your eye. We're not talking full on Fulci here, but it definitely like, for me, like evokes stuff like,
absolutely,
Fulci's movies and She and Andalou and all that like eye trauma. It's this sense of like, I'm going to take all the power and I'm going to, like, you wanted to penetrate me, I'm going to penetrate your eyes, and that's kind of where we go with it.
Absolutely, it's very. I think it always seems to be important in films when something happens to somebody's eye, because you always think this is ultimately to do with watching and looking, right? And I think that is very relevant. Now, I think that these are some of the most kind of uncomfortable and powerful torture scenes I've seen in films. But what I do find really interesting about them is that actually they're not necessarily as explicitly gratuitous as, for example, Fulci, right? I mean, the actual penetration of these needles into skin, most of them we don't actually see them, right? We're hearing it and we're seeing her look of glee as she kind of inserts things into him, and she's saying Kiri Kiri Kiri, but we don't actually see a hell of a lot, do we, in terms of this torture? And that I find brilliant.
Absolutely. I think because auditions are one of those films which, like on your own Patreon list, it always comes up as like either the scariest or the most disturbing or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, I certainly saw it on his list before I saw it, for real. And it's actually, when you break it down, it's like, again, like a magic trick. You don't actually see that much. But what you do have is these little details. So like, we talked about sound design before. There's a moment when she's putting the needles into, I don't think actually the eyeball, I think it's the eye socket just below.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
But I the last time I watched it, I had headphones on, and there was this bit of Foley where it's like a popping sound, like a grape being pierced. And
it's kind of squelchy a bit, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And then like there's like a detail where like the camera cuts to Aoyama's hand like thrashing, because he can't move because he's been paralyzed, but his arm's like shaking from the trauma. And it's those moments that sell it. And I think, in a way, it shouldn't be surprising, because we've known since stuff like Jaws that not seeing something is worse than seeing something.
Yes.
And of course, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like whatever you want to name, like often the very best horror films are kind of restrained, and certainly when you compare it to a lot of Miike's other movies,
oh my god, Ichi the Killer or something, it's way more graphic. But it's such brilliant kind of tonal management in this that it feels like one of the most extreme things you've ever watched in your life, I think. And that is, it's so powerful, and it's so prolonged. I mean, I think it's relentless, like you said. It's like basically the last third of the movie, and it just feels like it will never end, and then we get this final little showdown again, a kind of moment that still makes my heart kind of leap into my chest when the son comes home, and there's that final kind of chase up the stairs and everything, and it's quite a quick ending, it's quite an abrupt ending. But how do you find that kind of those final moments of the film?
Oh, I mean, it is heart and mouth stuff, because like by that point she's also sawn one of his feet off with the wire.
Yes, of course, yes.
Which, interestingly enough, is intercut with an image of her ballet teacher masturbating. Again, you've got that link of like, you delivered this violence onto me, I am returning it with the same rhythmic harm back onto you.
Exactly,
And so, the son comes in, he runs up the stairs, she comes after him, and he kicks her, and she goes down the stairs and breaks her neck. Her neck gets twisted when she hits the ground. But you have this kind of final moment of like weird uncanniness where she starts to speak in a very, very calm way with like a little coda. Basically, she says a few things, I think, at the end. But there's, I've been on my own all my life. So you have that note of sadness and loneliness.
Yeah.
That she's not just like a femme fatale psycho killer. There's something deeply sad about what's happened here. And I think the very last line, or certainly one of the very last lines, is, it'll be hard for you to get over, but you'll find life is wonderful one day. That's why we'll carry on with our lives. Yeah. And I think we end then with Asami as a young ballerina. And it's like, it's an absolutely transcendental ending. If you compare it to stuff that is commonly thought of as torture porn, like I know you're talking about Eli Roth's Hostel.
Yes.
Soon, and actually, Miike has a cameo in that. But I mean, no disrespect to Eli Roth, but like, it's night and day in terms of what's achieved between those two films. This is like almost like a profound philosophical meditation on human loneliness and existential breakdown between the sexes, and the trauma that we commit to each other, and the toxicity of male privilege, but actually how we still long for connection. Yeah. And it just ends on this absolutely. I find it almost like a spiritual experience, this film. I think it's just so profound, and so I hesitate to use the word elevated because it's got that negative connotation with elevated horror.
But I know what you mean.
乗り越えるのは辛いけど、でもきっと生きててよかったっていう時がまた必ず来るよ。だからみんな生きてんだから。
So how do you think this film, I mean, we touched upon it briefly already, but how do you think this film has aged? It's 20 years old now. Do you think it still holds up?
Yeah, no, I think I watched it again, obviously this year, and it could have been made this year, to be honest. It's a remarkable piece of work, and I think I mean, my view is it should be like required viewing, particularly for guys. Like, 'cause we talked about it just in passing. We talked about when we were kind of preparing for today, unconscious bias tests.
Yes.
So I can like maybe tweet something out about that if people want to have a go at them. But basically, you can do those to see how you've been socially programmed by your culture to have bias against different groups. And in particular, I'd encourage any guys listening to do an unconscious bias test on gender, because I think for me, I don't want to project too much, but I think this is definitely one of the things that I get from Audition, is that it just reminds you that you've got to be so mindful as a guy to really deal with your privilege. Because if you don't think about it, you're going to do something bad that's complicit. You might not actually hold an audition for a new wife, but like, you might be involved in all these kind of microaggressions or whatever, which you're not aware of. And so doing stuff like an unconscious bias test maybe puts it back on your radar, and you think, actually, how can I play my particular role in tackling toxic male privilege, tearing that stuff down, properly fighting for meaningful equality, and in my own relationships as much as on a macro scale.
Yes.
And ultimately, let's avoid people having their feet chopped off or harming each other in any way. That'd be really good.
Come on, guys, let's all avoid it if we can. No, I totally agree with you, and I think it's a really interesting thing, and I think it's probably going to be something we might touch upon, these kind of really interesting sort of gender dynamics. I think even in the next film we're going to talk about. Hello everybody, just interrupting this conversation momentarily to say a very special thank you to this week's sponsor. This week's sponsor is $20 patron Katie Dyer. A huge thank you to Katie for all of her support for the podcast. Now, usually in this section on the podcast, I would read a little message that our $20 sponsor has given us, or I would plug their particular website or blog or podcast, whatever they want me to say, basically. Katie has very kindly said she doesn't really have anything in particular to plug, but she'd be really grateful for me giving a little mention to Robert Lloyd Parry's Nunky Theatre, as she's a massive fan of his work, and she knows that this year has been tough for him, as it has been for all kind of theatre performers and actors, making anything happen in 2020. Nunky Theatre is a kind of storytelling company. It's based in Cambridgeshire, and they essentially they do very similar to what Adam Robinson does, a friend of the pod, Adam Robinson. Their main actor, Robert Lloyd Parry, performs live readings of M.R. James tales, and he does a spectacular job. It was actually friend of the pod, Adam Robinson, who first drew my attention to Robert Lloyd Parry's work, and we went together to go and see a performance of him doing Casting the Runes in London, and it was absolutely spectacular. It was like sitting in a small room with the ghost of M.R. James, having him sit there and directly kind of recount this tale to us in person. And then actually, me and friends of the pod, Rob Watts, Rihanna Dillon and Becky Dark, along with Adam, we went earlier this year to go and see him perform another collection of M.R. James tales, and that was Friday the 13th of March, and I remember that so clearly because it was essentially the last night out I had before lockdown. So that was a very special night for me in 2020. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of everything Robert Lloyd Parry does and Nunky Theatre. So a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, Katie Dyer, for plugging them. And if anyone wants to check out any of their work, just head to their website, nunky.co.uk, and I believe they've also got a YouTube channel that they link to on there, and you might be able to actually check out some of their brilliant performances. One more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, $20 patron and long-time listener, Katie Dyer. And if you want to become an Evolution of Horror sponsor, meaning that you get your own little section just like this one in which you can plug literally anything you like, then sign up now. Head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of our discussion, in which Tim Coleman and I discuss Park Chan-wook's Oldboy.
오늘도 역시 대충 수습이 안 된다. 난 이제 괴물이 돼버렸다. 끝날 것 같아. 이제 복수심이 아니라 내 성격이 돼버렸어. 누가 날 가뒀을까? 15년 동안 당신을 지켜봤어요. 상처받은 자한테 복수심만큼 잘 되는 사람도 없어요. 한번 해봐.
Odesu is a drunken, loutish, apathetic fool who, at the beginning of the film, is apparently been arrested on a drunken disorderly charge, is bailed out of the police station by his friend, and on the way to his daughter's birthday party, goes missing. And he is imprisoned for 15 years for reasons he does not know why, doesn't understand why, in a single-room hotel-like cell. And after 15 years is released, and he goes on a rip-roaring rampage of revenge to basically get back at the person or persons who did this to him.
Indeed. So what's your sort of history with this movie, and are you a fan?
I am a fan. I think Park Chan-wook as a director is probably in contention for my favourite director, because I think his hit rate is absolutely astonishing. He's got so many 5-star masterpieces to his name, and of which this is probably the famous. I probably have other films of his which I prefer slightly, but I think, yeah, it's a remarkable film, stylistically, and of course with a third act which will probably scar you for life as well, so as we will come to in due course.
And that's, from somebody who's just described the third act of Audition, so that's it's another very traumatizing final act. And that's the thing, I mean, this film is not really a horror film. Like you said, it's a revenge movie, really, more than anything. But yes. I think that there are some really interesting thematic similarities, and also there's a hell of a lot of psychological horror and a hell of a lot of body horror in this. Regardless of whether or not the package itself is purely a horror film. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's a very interesting film to talk about within this context, right? Yeah, no, I mean, it's worth saying because it's a Korean movie. Koreans famously care not for the ideas of generic conformity. They will do what they want, and that's what makes Korean films so exhilarating often, is that you just don't know what you are watching a lot of the time. And Park Chan-wook, like you said, I mean, what an incredible director. I suppose he's maybe more well-known recent films are films like The Handmaiden, right, which is just beautiful film. But he's done so much good stuff. This was obviously the second in a sort of trilogy of vengeance films that he did, which again, the other two are also brilliant. Do you have any? You said this might not be your favourite Park Chan-wook movie. What is your favourite?
So my personal favourite is Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, which was the first in the Vengeance trilogy, and the film that actually he made just before Oldboy. I guess we'll come into it later on. I think there is so much ambivalence and ambiguity in Oldboy that I could see that for some people that would be something they really connect with. It is so the sands on which you stand are so uncertain and shifting throughout the whole of that film, both morally and in terms of plot. Certainly by the end, where you stand on it is so problematic and so difficult to get
in every way you conceive it. Exactly.
And you listen to interviews, or you hear Director Park talk about it, and that's exactly what he wanted. He wanted you to go away going absolutely like, what am I going to? How do I even talk about this? And,
I know, yeah.
But for me, I think all three of the Vengeance trilogy films. So you've got Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, Oldboy, and then Lady Vengeance was made afterwards, and all three of them, as revengers, problematize the kind of traditional construct of righteous revenge.
Yes.
Where, typically in Revengers, and nothing against Revengers, I like Revengers, they're normally built around the cathartic arc that something bad happens to somebody at the beginning, they come back and they wreak bloody vengeance on those who've done it to them, and then there's a cathartic moment of escapism in that carnage.
Well, obviously same year as Oldboy was Kill Bill, right? Surely one of the most famous Western revenge movies there is, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And of course, the relationship between Tarantino and Director Park cemented when Tarantino was on the jury at Cannes the year that Oldboy got the Grand Prix. But yeah, basically all of his films, they refuse to give you that cathartic release, and they make you suffer, and they make you question what you believe about revenge and what you believe about justice and what you believe about catharsis, and you come out with none of those things probably, but but you come out just like, again, with like a deeply empathetic and deeply humane view. And I won't spoil Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, but I'll say this, is that while you're watching it, your sympathy and your empathy goes from character to character.
Yeah.
And so by the end, much like Audition, you just sympathize with everybody. And I would actually say that for Oldboy as well. Like, it really plays with your sympathy and your empathy consistently, so that at different points you will end up sympathizing and empathizing with people that logically you shouldn't do, but emotionally you do. And I think, again, that's so morally mature, because in Western society as well, like, we see it perhaps now more than ever, like, we are in these kind of entrenched binaries where you're either this or you're that, and we demonize and dehumanize the people on the other side of the fence rather than
cancel them.
And cancel them, exactly. I'm not like for a second saying we shouldn't be absolutely rigorous in our opposition of certain ideologies. We absolutely should be. Certain things have got no place in the civilized world. But what we also, like, what we get from, like, Director Park's movies is people who do absolutely heinous things, like really, really morally bankrupt or morally difficult things, and yet their humanity and your empathy for them as human beings remains intact. And that, again, it's like a miracle, to be honest. He pulls it off.
I love that. I love films that, like you, I love films that kind of provoke me a little bit and challenge me a little bit. And this film is, like you said about Audition, I mean, for me, this is one of it would probably be in my top 20 movies of all time. Absolutely blew my mind the first time I watched it. And it still gets me every single time. I rewatched it last night and I still love this movie. It still disturbs the living hell out of me at the end. It still makes me feel deeply uncomfortable, but it's still thrilling. It's also funny. There's kind of broad comedy in it as well. In places it's kind of wacky. Again, there's this bizarre tonal juggling act going on in this film that sort of Pan-Asian and Eastern cinema, I just think does so well, better than anyone else, don't you think? And the way that this film makes me feel from one scene to the next and 1 minute to the next is just, I love that. I absolutely love it. And it's just beautiful looking, and it's just stunningly shot, isn't it, as well,
Yeah, I mean, it's probably worth saying that when Director Park got into cinema, so he was born in 1963, kind of quite cultured family. His dad was a professor, and he went to study aesthetics at university, and aesthetics being the branch of philosophy which is to do with beauty. And he was growing up under the military dictatorship in Korea, and so a lot of cinema was kind of censored, but he kind of encountered and fell in love with Alfred Hitchcock at that time, and in particular Vertigo, which I think is really interesting when we talk then about Oldboy, because Vertigo is a hypnotic film about fluid identity of a female character in particular, and that idea of hypnosis and fluid female identity is very much important for Oldboy.
Absolutely, and a kind of slightly warped perspective of our main character, right? An almost unreliable narrator in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it makes sense then, because, like, we talk about the beauty of Oldboy, and it is an absolutely visually stunning film.
Yes.
It makes sense. It's made by a guy who studied aesthetics, fell in love with Hitchcock, then fell in love with, I think, Peckinpah as well. So he's kind of blending this kind of high-minded philosophical and literary mindset with the kind of thriller structure of Hitchcock, with the teeth-rattling violence of Peckinpah.
Yes.
And then you get Director Park Chan-wook. So, which is marvelous. He's a pretty much singular voice, I would say.
Definitely. Well, let me start off by asking you about that, about just the way this film looks, I suppose. Park Chan-wook's incredible style. Now, when we talked about Audition, it had that kind of low-key drama feel to it, right? And the horror is, in some ways, quite mundane, the way it kind of sneaks up on you. There's a kind of subconscious filmmaking, in a way, like we've already discussed. Whereas it is, all about the style in Oldboy, isn't it? There's nothing subtle really about this. We've got swooshing camera moves, we've got these crazy transitions, we've got long take fight scenes, we've got slow-mo, we've got fast-mo, we've got hallucinations, bugs, giant CGI ants on trains, all kinds of stuff going on here. Do you like this style?
Yeah, I do. It's absolutely beautiful, and even like very simple things like how he transitions from shot to shot.
Yeah.
Is ridiculously creative, and it's something across his filmography as well. Like, he does it. Certainly, I think the majority of the things he did in the noughties. So, like, after the Vengeance trilogy, he made also "I'm a Cyborg, but That's Okay," which has a very similar kind of crazed cinematography, and it's so beautiful to look at. It's super creative, super arresting.
It really is. Let me start off by asking you then about that crazy first act, I suppose. We're introduced to the character of Odesu in that kind of comedic opening scene, really. Like you say, he appears as a bit of a fool. Then he disappears and he is kidnapped and he is imprisoned in this strange hotel room. And what we get then is kind of 15 minutes of kind of vignettes of time passing in this room as Odesu basically loses his mind, right? It's almost like a little miniature version of Roman Polanski's Repulsion, this character just losing their grip on reality as the walls close in on them.
I mean, how do you even talk about it? It is like almost overwhelming.
It is overwhelming, yeah.
It's like if you imagine you were locked in the Overlook Hotel forced to take acid, and basically you just went out of your mind because like he starts hallucinating. He talking about loneliness again because he is literally on his own for 15 years. Like, people don't talk to him. He gets his food for like a little hole at the bottom of the door, and he hallucinates in one scene of ants crawling under his skin and then out of his body and then over his face. But it tonally, again, it's like oddly funny. There's a bit where he's looking at a painting of kind of monstrous smiling face, and he tries to imitate it, but it's this kind of teethy grimace, and it's so it's tragic and it's unsettling, but it's funny, and it just kind of straddles all those feelings simultaneously.
It is. It's absurdist, I think, isn't it? It's so extreme, and we also have kind of a montage of images from the news of things happening, to convey time passing. There's a lot of different sort of directorial and editorial techniques that director Park uses, right, to kind of convey that feeling of isolation and madness, and also the amount of time passing as well. There's like tick-tocking of clocks and all of this kind of thing as well. It's very clever.
I think on the time thing, it's worth like saying like all the imagery to do with time. Like even before we get to that stage, when the titles come up, they start to tick round, so to kind of imply the passage of time. Like you said, you get the montage of things on the television to kind of show the passage of time. But you also get like one of the images that comes on TV, I think, is Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster.
Yes.
Which becomes quite, I think, thematically important because essentially as the plot progresses, it becomes clear that Odesu is turned almost by his experiences into something of a monster himself.
Yeah. They make references to him being a beast, don't they, quite a few times?
Yeah, and Beast was the working title for the film before it was Oldboy. So there's something there in terms of like just as Frankenstein's creature was created and then ultimately, spoilers for the novel by Mary Shelley. I know it's like, very, 100 plus years old. What is it now? 200, 150 years old. But of course, at the end of that novel, it's about the creature trying to essentially destroy its creator. And that's broadly what you could say the plot of Oldboy is. It's about him wanting to destroy the man or person that did this to him. And so it's interesting that that's kind of seeded a little bit there in terms of the stuff that's coming through on his television.
That's so cool. That's such a good point. And I think that's going to be something we're going to talk about as we go on, right? This idea that is he a man or is he a beast? And actually, speaking of, I think, this kind of links to that point, the next major moment I want to talk to you about. So 15 years pass, he doesn't break out, actually. He's let out of this cell. one of the first things he does is go to a sushi restaurant, right? And we kind of know at the end why exactly he walks directly into this particular sushi restaurant. But there is this now very controversial and famous moment in this sushi restaurant, right, where he orders a squid or an octopus. He says, I want to eat something that's still alive. And in this kind of still, I think, quite shocking moment, he grabs this live squid, it's very clearly live, and just bites into it and starts eating it. And as he's eating it, it's kind of still moving around. It kind of latches onto his face. It's a deeply uncomfortable moment.
Yeah, no, it's gruesome. I think absolutely. It's a shocking moment. I think there were about 3 or 4 moments in Oldboy which kind of fueled its notoriety, and this is probably the first one chronologically in the narrative. What I'd say is kind of interesting is, you guys on your Extreme season on Patreon been talking about Cannibal Holocaust, which is a film which is famous for its real-life animal cruelty and animal death.
Yes.
And it's interesting that certain films like Cannibal Holocaust get really singled out for that, but then probably most people give Oldboy a pass.
It's very true.
Because Cannibal Holocaust is Grindhouse, and Oldboy won the Grand Prix at Cannes. So,
yeah.
but he full on eats a live octopus, man. And he said two others that gave their life and didn't make the cut of the film. So make of that what you will.
Right. You're absolutely right. It's just awful, isn't it? But there's a sort of it's the unconscious bias thing again, I think, but there's something about an octopus in a sushi restaurant that feels less extreme to me than an endangered giant turtle. I think that's the difference from my perspective. But there shouldn't be a difference, but that I think that's what it is as well. But it's no matter, like you say, it's still actually a very much talked about, notorious, controversial scene. It's something that Spike Lee cut from his American remake of the film as well.
Yes,
and again, it kind of really goes to emphasize this idea that this man is a beast. He's come out the other side of this 15-year imprisonment as a almost feral, right? He's like beastly in the way he moves and eats and talks and everything else.
That's it. But there's also the sense of because he says, I want to eat something living, and that's why he eats the octopus, in the sense that he's been for 15 years robbed basically of contact with other living people or creatures. And so actually when he first gets out, he stumbles out of a suitcase on a rooftop, and he meets this suicidal guy up there with his dog, and he grabs the guy's hand and starts rubbing his hand all over his face, because it's like, I just haven't seen another human being, and now it's like, I always want to consume life, I want to live life vivaciously. And so I'm not making a case one way or the other about whether that scene should be in the film from an animal welfare point of view, but it thematically makes sense. It does. As actually thematically, the stuff in Cannibal Holocaust makes sense as well.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. So in this scene, in the sushi restaurant, we also meet the character of Mido. Now, where do we even start with Mido? I think what's really tricky here, and of course, I'm going to say one more time, spoiler alert here. We're going to talk about spoilers from the start. Of course, the big reveal is that Mido is his daughter, right? But at this point, we don't know that. He doesn't know that.
Yes.
How do you find the portrayal of Mido throughout this film? Because I think it's quite tricky to navigate, because we don't really see a sort of true portrayal of Mido, because in some ways she's being brainwashed, she's being controlled. So therefore, all of her actions throughout the film are just really odd.
Yeah, no, it is odd. And I think it's something that only makes sense when you get to the end. And so, again, spoiler alert for the very end, it becomes clear that that both Odesu and Mido have been hypnotized by Lee Woo Jin, who is the antagonist, and basically to fall in love, because her behavior towards him makes no sense on any kind of rational level. She takes him home, and he almost immediately tries to rape her.
Yeah.
Not knowing that she's his daughter. I mean, not that makes it better or worse or whatever, but and she repels him, but she doesn't kick him out of that stage. She's very conciliatory to him, even though he's just attempted to rape her in the toilet.
It's a deeply uncomfortable scene, isn't it? I think not just because of the attempted rape, but because of how she handles it afterwards. Well,
this is it, because she fends him off. She kind of almost not pistol whipped because she's holding a knife, but she bangs him on the head with the butt of like a carving knife. He goes away like ashamed of what he's tried to do. And like, you know, a normal human reaction would be like, get out of my house. I never want to see you again. I'm going to call the cops. But she doesn't. She comes out and she's like very conciliatory, and somehow they continue to have a blossoming romantic relationship after this. Now, if you don't know about the hypnotism on first watch, you watch this and go like, who is she? And like, what is this? And it doesn't make any sense. But like in retrospect, you see that they are both, their autonomy has been stripped of them, and they are basically now simply acting out a preordained fatalistic path that has been plotted for them by the antagonist.
That's it. And it's so uncomfortable and kind of gross, whichever way you look at it, you know, whether you know that or not. Because I think when you first watch it, you know, he sexually attacks her. And then she kind of instantly goes, oh, don't worry about it. It's probably my own fault for inviting you back to my flat. And, you know, you'd have expected this. And she says something almost akin to sort of, oh, try again another time. Maybe you'll get luckier next time or something. You know, really odd, really jarring, doesn't work. But of course, then with that sort of prior knowledge that she's being controlled and manipulated and these two people are being moved around like pawns for this ultimate result, it kind of makes a bit more sense. It doesn't make it any less gross or uncomfortable. I think that's the thing.
And even on second view or third view, in terms of what did we think about Mido, it's difficult because she has pretty much no agency then throughout the whole film. Odesu does uncover the truth eventually, and she never does. And so there's a sense in which she is not ever fully rounded as a character. And you know, is that problematic? Is that difficult? Yes, it is, but it's also kind of part of the point of the film. And so this goes into what we were saying earlier about the ambiguity that underpins Oldboy. There's so much in there which you don't know how to feel about it because you have conflicting emotions simultaneously, and Director Park just asks you to sit with that and just hold it. Just hold those feelings.
There's no moral compass in this film, is there? There's no landing on what's right and what's wrong and who's right and who's wrong, really. Like you say, you just have to sit with it with all of these characters.
Which again, like going back to the thing we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation about what's different between Asian and Western cinema. Like if you look at Spike Lee's remake of Oldboy, and a lot of the violence is in there, if not more so. The incest is still in there, but the moral through line is a little bit less murky. You know, all the messed up stuff happens still, but the way it handles it, there's a sense it's a bit clearer, and you know how you're supposed to feel about most of it. There is no such comfort or certainty in the original. It is absolutely, you are at sea trying to figure out what you think about these very messed up situations and just trying to figure it out.
You're absolutely right. But I do think there is an element of, once again, like Audition, a film that is commenting on misogyny, I think. That kind of casual misogyny that all of the male characters have throughout this film. Whenever they talk about girls from school and they go, oh yeah, we remember her, she was a, you know, blah, blah, blah. They use all these slurs to suggest that these certain girls were sort of promiscuous or that they had what they got coming to them. And you know, I think Park Chan-wook is far too smart a filmmaker not to be planting that kind of stuff in there deliberately and, you know, saying something about the way in which men in this world treat women.
And it's perhaps also because this is towards the beginning of his proliferation as a filmmaker, you know, although he had been making films since the early 90s, really it was only with JSA, Joint Security Area, in 2000, and then Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance and Oldboy that he kind of really started establishing himself as a filmmaker. And so I think there is an element of he developed as a filmmaker, because there's also some quite problematic lesbian stereotypes in Lady Vengeance in the prison. Yeah, and some people have said like, well, then he makes The Handmaiden, you know, like 11 years later as a way of apologizing for that, essentially, and kind of showing a far more nuanced and well-rounded queer narrative there. I mean, the whole film is difficult, you know, morally difficult. So, you know, it's morally difficult on gender, incest, the whole thing, man. So
exactly. So let me jump straight on. Let me ask you broadly, I guess, across the whole film, really. What do you think of the violence in this film? Okay, because speaking of this film in a sort of body horror context, we've got, again, some wince-inducing, for me, moments of body horror, one in particular involving teeth that I still kind of have to turn away from. How do you find the handling of violence in this film?
I like it.
I guess it's certainly more cathartic than violence in Audition, for example, right? I mean, it's a different type of violence,
and it's mixed in with like the tone is really interesting. Some of it's played almost for laughs at times.
Yeah.
So the bit with the teeth. He finds out where he was held hostage. He goes back there with a hammer. And the guy who was responsible for running this kind of unofficial prison, he kind of basically straps him down, gets the I don't know what you call the sharp end of a hammer, like the two-pronged bit, and starts putting it on the guy's teeth and just going crack, just pulling them out. But the whole thing it's played fairly broadly. So, and again, I don't think personally, and I'm happy to debate this with other people, I think Western films are often more explicit. You compare it, for instance, to Spike Lee's remake. Like Josh Brolin, who plays the Odesu character called Joe in that film, like he goes into that unofficial prison. And he's literally like, kind of, he almost like cuts a guy's head off slowly with like a Stanley knife, basically.
Yeah.
And it's a much longer scene, much more sadistic. There's more like gore. There's Director Park's movie, you have that moment, but it does cut away from it, and so you just see like the bloody teeth dropping on the keyboard, and then of course you have the famous corridor fight scene. But again, like it's a beautiful thing to look at. It's all in one take on the side. Again, like Director Park talks about it as being like a Renaissance painting almost. Yeah. That's the aesthetics student talking there.
Love it.
But like, there's a sense of it's not particularly gory. Like, yes, he's punching people and hitting them with a hammer, but there's not like blood splats or whatever. It's got a different tone. It's a little bit more tasteful, if I can deign to use that word. It's
oh, totally. And I think the fight scene is definitely a different kind of thing, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's mesmerizing. That single take, the choreography. It's basically like a choreographed dance scene, isn't it? I mean, it's not even really believable as a fight scene, as one man being able to beat all of these hundreds of assassins off with a single hammer, but it's all part of that beautiful kind of stylized thing that he's going for. But yeah, you're so right about that. The teeth scene is probably less gratuitous than a lot of American stuff. It's like what we were talking about with Audition, and yet somehow it's more effective to me. I mean, I've seen the Spike Lee version, and I don't even remember a scene where he cuts off somebody's head. I found that film quite forgettable in comparison. So it's interesting that scenes from Oldboy that maybe are less gratuitous really stick with me, and it's the teeth, and then later on in the final act of the film it's the tongue, it's the cutting off of his own tongue, which again I find absolutely wince-inducing and grotesque as well, but in a really powerful way.
And I know you've spoken about this before on the podcast. It's the moments of physical pain which are almost smaller evoke a greater level of empathy, because we've all had like toothache, we've all we've all maybe had like an ulcer or something on our tongue, so you know how sensitive your mouth is.
Yes.
The idea
or
of
accidentally biting our own tongue, for example. It's like
yeah, exactly. Like, so imagine having to chop your own tongue off, or someone like literally just cracking your teeth out, and like you can imagine it. So like compared to like chopping someone's head off, like, well, I have no idea how that would feel like, because that's so dramatic. But like teeth coming out or whatever is there's a greater level of empathy there.
Exactly. What do you think of our I guess the closest thing this film has to a villain, the character of Woo Jin, who I think is a really interesting character, a really brilliant performer as well. What do you think of him and his role in this story?
Yeah, I absolutely love him.
Yeah, isn't he brilliant?
He's a fantastic performance, fantastic character. So the actor is Ji Tae-yu, and I guess for me, this is probably the thing I really love about Oldboy, is who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist, because we talk about him. I spoke about him as being the antagonist because he's essentially the puppet master who's been putting Odesu through this, but Odesu is not a likable character. He's cruel and he's mean. Like, even at the very beginning when he gets out, he tells his story to the guy about to commit suicide, and then the guy wants to talk to him, and he just like goes off and leaves him, and the guy kills himself. And so he's a horrible guy, really. Yeah. Now, it's not that Woo Jin as a character is a nice guy, but like what it basically emerges from him is that he's got this, at least a moral, however twisted, he still has like a moral reason for why he's doing what he's doing. And
Yes.
Are we okay to get onto that now?
Absolutely. Let's get into it. Yeah.
Okay. So it eventually emerges towards the third act that the reason that Lee Woo Jin has been doing this to Odesu is when they were all kids at the same high school, Odesu accidentally saw Lee Woo Jin and his sister not quite having sex, but like almost having sex. Like they were basically in advanced stages of foreplay. And it becomes clear that they're having an incestuous relationship. And as a result, she kills herself. Because Odesu has got loose lips. He talks too much, as he keeps on saying throughout the film. And it leads to the girl, she's bullied and then ends her life. And basically, because Lee Woo Jin is a wealthy man, he devotes the rest of his life to essentially contriving circumstances where Odesu will sleep incestuously with his own daughter and therefore experience what he had. So essentially falling in love with a member of his own family romantically.
Yes.
Now, what's so fantastic about the performance is that if you just describe that, you're like, dude, I am never going to empathize with somebody like that, because like that is messed up. Like I don't want to like shame different people's life choices, but like I think incest is still like one of the big taboos. Like if you say like, you know, even really open-minded liberal people will probably say, I probably draw the line at sleeping with your sister or your brother.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
But the way that Ji Tae-yu plays it is so rich in, like, on one level he's kind of swaggering and smarmy, but another level he's like so deeply moved and sad. And there was a sense that actually he wasn't just like sleeping with his sister just for sex. He genuinely fell in love with her.
Yes, absolutely.
And so he contrives it so that Odesu and Mido genuinely fall in love with them. They're not just sleeping together. And he's not abusing her. There's a genuine romantic relationship there, and that is the kicker that really sits at the end of Oldboy. Because when you find that out at the end, I mean, it's like your stomach falls out the bottom of your body, and you're hit by a train, and it is the most like I watched Oldboy again today, and I was like, it just makes me feel equally physically sick and like I also want to cry, because at the same time, because it's so sad. And it also just makes me feel so uncomfortable. And I'll tell you what, there are probably no other film that's given me nausea and and deep emotion simultaneously. Probably the closest I've had to that kind of disparate emotions has been Mike Flanagan's Haunting of Hill House, where like I feel like I'm burst into tears and I'm terrified at the same time. Like that kind of disparate emotional landscape.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? I kind of come close at the end of Audition, but there you go. It's that really interesting thing again. But you're so right. It's so messed up on so many levels, and yet there is something. There's something, dare I say, even more likable about Lee Woo Jin, right, than there is about Odesu himself. You're absolutely right. Odesu is they kind of the film makes a point of kind of saying over and over again, this is not a nice guy, really. He's you know, we're following him in his plight, and therefore he's kind of our protagonist. But really, there's not a whole lot to like or sympathise with, and yet, even though this guy did this absolutely heinous thing, he was. Yeah, like you say, it's a revenge story, but really it's just as much Lee Woo Jin's revenge story, isn't it? That's the thing. It's about him getting his revenge on what was done to him when he was young. So it is really fascinating, and I think director Park does a lot of that, of drawing these kind of parallels between them. There's even a weird shot where there's a sort of split screen between their two faces, isn't there, and everything, and that they are kind of two sides of the same coin, particularly by the end of the film, you know, that they've done the same things, they've done the same awful things, the same messed up things, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's those kind of visual cues, like you said, the split screen stuff and the overlay between them. A lot of use of mirrors through the film as well. A lot of dualism. And from a Frankenstein point of view, going back to that, in his director's commentary, director Park talks about they wanted to do some stuff around Bride of Frankenstein, where Frankenstein's creature destroys his creator's lab.
Yes. But
he kind of semi-regrets taking it out, but it was supposed to be at the end when Odesu goes up to Lee Woo Jin's department. It's like he's destroying the lab that created him.
Right, yeah.
And even at the very, very end, then, I guess we'll come to the confrontation in a second, but at the very, very end, there's a moment where Odesu now knows that Mido is his daughter in an absolutely heartbreaking sequence with a photo album. And he then has to decide that bit, man.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, but yeah,
we'll come back to that. We need to give that proper focus.
Yeah,
but he then has to decide like what he's going to do. And there's a bit about with hypnotism again where he's looking at himself in a reflection, and one half of his reflection is walking away into green light, and the side that stays is in purple light. And by this stage, like green and purple have been very much coded to be associated with different things. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense almost like it's a bit like the old Ealing movie Dead of Night. If you remember the sequence with the puppet, the ventriloquist puppet.
Yeah.
And spoilers for Dead of Night, but at the end of that story, the ventriloquist who has like a split personality, he's projecting through the dummy. He tries to suffocate the dummy, but actually kills his human half, and the monstrous side survives. It's kind of a bit like that at the end of Oldboy, where half of Odesu is split and disappears, and he thinks it's the monstrous side. But maybe it's the human side that is destroyed, and it's the monster that survives. And there's all this stuff like of dualism between Odesu and Woo Jin, and Odesu the monster versus Odesu the man. The whole, from a psychological point of view, it is so rich. You could literally write a book on it. It's absolutely marvelous.
Let me ask you then about that incredible gut-wrenching twist. We've kind of talked about it briefly already. You know, in the great tradition of, you know, some of the best movie twists, people talk about, you know, movies like The Usual Suspects or David Fincher's Seven as having, you know, some of the all-time great movie twists. I think this is pretty much the all-time great movie twist, and I think it's so elegantly handled. So there's that moment where Woo Jin decides to reveal to Odesu everything, and it's a very kind of low-key moment. All of the music cuts out, and Woo Jin starts to hum the kind of old boy sort of school anthem, right, as he moves his laser pen across a room. Eventually, the laser pen lands on that purple box. Odesu walks over to the purple box. Inside is a photo album, and he begins to look through it. And what starts as photos of him 15 years ago with his family slowly kind of move through time, right? And I think there is this sudden thought that I always get at this point too of, oh yeah, he had a wife and a daughter. And the film does a really good job at the beginning, I think, of kind of dismissing the fact that he had a wife and daughter and almost going, don't worry about that, you know, and very cleverly, like almost like we've been mind controlled to forget about them. And there's this sudden reminder that, oh yes, he had a wife and daughter. And then we see the photos flip through time. And we see his daughter grow older and older and older, and eventually it is revealed that his daughter is the woman that he met in that sushi restaurant, who he has had sex with and who he has fallen in love with. And it's, again, a kind of beautiful and elegant way of revealing one of the most disturbing and devastating plot twists of all time, right?
It is devastating is the word. I mean, even just talking about it, I'll be honest, I feel a little bit sick. Talking about it because it's like, what is worse than dying? What is worse than the people you love dying? It's being made to live knowing you've done something like that. Yeah. And not only that you've done that, but you are now in that relationship, essentially. It's like, so what are you going to do? Like,
and what does he do? I mean, we'll get onto that in a minute, because what the hell does he do? But the reveal of that is so interesting. The way Odesu reacts to it. You know, this is a film filled with big style, big performances, and it really goes kind of over the top and operatic here as Odesu drops to the floor and you know, licks the boots and begs for forgiveness, you know. Yeah,
no, it's fantastic. And I guess, like, as unlikable as he is as a character, Odesu, how he then behaves in that next sequence, he kind of goes charging at Woo Jin, the bodyguard steps in, absolutely like thrashes Odesu. Yeah. But Odesu managed to score like a lucky hit. He's holding some scissors and he manages to pop it into the guy's ear. The bodyguard's still like throttling Odesu, even though he's gushing blood out of his ear. And because Woo Jin doesn't want the bodyguard to kill Odesu, he comes up and blows the head off his own bodyguard. And then Odesu just goes into this protracted, devastated state of like kneeling before Lee Woo Jin, and one minute he's like threatening him, saying if Mido finds out, I'm gonna kill you.
Yeah.
And then he's like, I'm sorry. He's licking his boots. I'll be your dog. And it is just like he's utterly destroyed as a person. He absolutely like as a psychologically broken down. And you do this wonderful like it's held for a long time, and then the camera just slowly turns up and see what Lee Woo Jin's reaction is. He's just laughing. He's just covering his mouth, just laughing, and it's like that's his revenge. It's not that he's killed Mido or so he's done something worse to them.
Yes, he had basically been playing. He's played a hell of a long game, hasn't he, Lee Woo Jin? But this has been the moment that he's been working towards. His entire vengeance plan ends here, peaks here, it climaxes here for him, doesn't it? With Ode-suk just a broken mess on the floor, begging for forgiveness and licking his boot. Is what he wanted, and he's done from that. That's the end of Lee Woo Jin. He then basically decides that there's nothing left for him to live for from that point onwards, is there?
Well, this is because there's a couple of little details just before, like, because Lee Woo Jin leaves the room and kills himself, but what he does, he set up this thing that he's got a pacemaker in his heart that if you press this button, it'll kill him. And he gives the remote to Ode-suk, saying, "Here you go, you can kill me now." And by this point, Ode-suk has cut his own tongue off. He's kind of gagging on like a thing that he's holding in his mouth to kind of stop himself bleeding. And he presses the button to kill Lee Woo Jin, and it's not his pacemaker. It's a recording of him having sex with his daughter.
Oh my God, it's just...
And it's like, oh man, like it's just... Absolutely, and like because now you're listening to the sex scene, which you saw the first time around, you're like, okay, it's a sex scene, and now you're listening to it and you're like, oh my gosh, what have I watched? What am I watching? And Lee Woo Jin just basically goes in the elevator and is like, bye. Basically, he's saying like, now I've put you in the situation I was in. I genuinely loved my sister romantically, and now you genuinely love your daughter. Goodbye.
Yes,
and then we have a very moving sequence in the elevator where Lee Woo Jin's smiling and the smile fades from his face, and he then remembers the day that his sister killed herself, and it's revealed that he was holding her, trying to stop her from throwing herself off the bridge.
Yeah,
but that actually then he chose to let her go because she was asking him to.
Yeah,
and
then there's that really kind of he's got that really kind of devastated look on his face when he's lying dead in the elevator as well, which is really moving. I find, you know,
yes, because he's given himself a revenge. It's the old adage, I think like Kim Newman talks about it on some of like a feature on Oldboy about the old adage that if you want to commit revenge, you better dig two graves, one for you, the person you're going to get, and one for yourself. And that's exactly what happens to Lee Woo Jin as he gets there, and then he just realizes his life is over now. He's got nothing to live for, and the hand with which Director Park says this, that the hand that he let go of his sister with, he kind of changes in the elevator. It's like he kind of clutches it as if he's holding a gun, and it cuts to a gunshot, and he's blown his own brains out. And like I said, there's a very sad look on his face, and the smoke just gently, elegatically rising from a bullet hole in his head. And that is it. That is it for Lee Woo Jin. So it's
beautiful, and again, how weird that this weird guy who had sex with his sister, who did all these awful things, you kind of feel a bit sad for him in that moment, right? You know, you do, because it's like, you talk about great twists, like with Seven, and Seven is a great twist, of course it is. But you don't feel sorry for John Doe at the end of that movie. No,
you know?
No, exactly.
You're like, oh, that's a real kicker, but
yeah, you're not conflicted in who you're sympathising with in that film. You know, there's the difference.
No,
yeah,
that's it. And but this is like, it's just. Again, going back to what we were saying about Audition, it's just rich empathy for everybody involved.
Yeah,
it's like, if you wanted to say at the beginning, hey, do you want to feel empathy for this guy who sleeps with his sister and imprisons a guy for 15 years? You'd be like, no, of course not. But the journey you go through is like, I just feel empathy for all of them now. Like, and then I don't know how to feel about that. You know,
agreed. Yeah, it's wonderful. And then this final fucked up coda. This scene that is kind of ambiguous, but like you said, it's kind of pretty horrible no matter what way you think about it, where Ode-suk, then there's this beautiful scene out in the snow where he is choosing to be hypnotized, right, by this woman that's hypnotized him before, and she warns him, doesn't she? She says, look, this could go wrong, this could mess up your brain or your memories, But what happens then is essentially we find out that Odesu has asked to be hypnotized so that I believe he can forget that the woman he's been having sex with is his daughter, which is so horrible in so many ways, right? And then we go through that beautiful scene where Odesu kind of, in his head, he splits in two. One Odesu knows the secret, the other one doesn't, and one of them goes away and kills themselves and disappears, and only one is left. And then at the end of the film, he has this embrace with his daughter in the snow after he's woken up from being hypnotized. And I guess the question is, which Odesu is left? Does he remember that this is his daughter, or has he forgotten? Is this a happier ending if he's forgotten, or is this a happier ending if he remembers? It's all so gross and disturbing no matter which way I look at it. What did you make of this ending?
So I think, Director Park is intentionally ambiguous, so you can take from it what you want to take from it, which makes it even more complex. But like my particular personal reading on it is the film throughout is kind of coded with red, green and purple in particular is the colour for Woo Jin.
Yes.
And in that final moment where he's splitting himself, the bit of Odesu which survives is the purple side. And the other side is the green side, which perhaps represents freedom or decay or whatever. And the green side goes to death, off to die. But the purple side survives. So if you think, okay, well, the purple side then is the side of the character who loved his sister and was had no shame in that. And that's the bit that survives. And so if he then goes off to get hypnotized to take away the guilt so he doesn't remember that Mido is his sister, it's kind of like he wants to forget it so he can stay with her and feel unconflicted about actually sleeping with his own daughter. And brother, that is not a good way to be.
It's really, really gross. And the thing is, it's all so beautifully ambiguous either way. It's like that spinning top ending at the end of Inception, isn't it? Where, of course, he wakes up from the hypnosis and there is this moment of like, did it work? Has he forgotten that this woman he's in love with is his daughter? She runs up to him and she's like, oh, are you okay? And she confesses her love for him and they embrace. And the last thing we see is their embrace, and Odesu kind of smiles, but then that smile becomes sort of tinged with pain, right? And it's that similar kind of smile that he gave in the beginning when he's looking at that painting that's kind of, laugh and the world laughs with you, cry and you cry alone. And there's that kind of fine line between laughing and weeping. And again, he has all of that on his face at the same time. So did the hypnosis not work? Does he remember that she's his daughter? Or did it work? And in which case, is he going to now just have a relationship with his daughter? I mean, like, what? It's grim and disturbing and devastating no matter what happens, isn't it, really?
Because, what side of the fence do you want to be on as an audience member? Like, I think Director Park refers to it as either an unhappy, happy ending or a happy, unhappy ending. And it is that. I guess my personal view on it is, going back to the Frankenstein metaphor, is of course Frankenstein, the story ends in the frozen wastelands of the Arctic.
Indeed,
where the creator is destroyed and then the monster goes off into the ice. And that's kind of what happens at the end of Oldboy, where the creator is destroyed and then the monster goes off into the ice. Yeah. What happens then isn't solidified in Oldboy, but there is that sense of, whichever way you cut it, I think Woo Jin won. Yes. He wrecked Odesu's life for the rest of his life, whichever way we go down that. Whatever your reading of the ending, it's either he remembers and he can't be with this woman he loves, or he doesn't remember and he is going to carry on being with his daughter, which is messed up. So it's kind of like,
And that's Oldboy. Let me ask you, similar to Audition, do you think this film still kind of holds up? Is this a film you'd still recommend to people?
Recommend. You got to be. There are some films that you got to be careful who you recommend them to, I think. And of course, it's a fantastic film objectively, but if you say, hey man, do you want to watch this film about incest? You might lose a few friends depending on who you recommend it to. Yeah,
like you say, it's still the great taboo subject, isn't it? I think, it never stops being deeply, deeply uncomfortable and nauseating. And I love that this film goes as far as it does with all of these elements and all of these themes.
It does. I mean, the thing that still commends it to me is the empathy, though, because I just think one thing that this world needs more of is empathy. And it doesn't mean you're condoning anybody. Like, for instance, you don't condone the actions of Woo Jin or Odesu, but you feel for them all. And I think that's something we could all do a bit more of.
Absolutely. There you go. So before we wrap up this week's episode, let's head on over to Wild About Horror, because I, for one, am dying to hear what Freudian cinephile Mary Wild thinks of Park Chan-wook's Oldboy.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here. This week I'm taking a look at Park Chan-wook's neo-noir action thriller Oldboy. It's the story of Odesu, who is imprisoned for 15 years and when finally released, finds himself trapped in a web of conspiracy and violence, trying to understand the motives of his captor, Woo Jin. On a quest for vengeance, Odesu falls in love with a young sushi chef, Mido, who turns out to be his daughter. Yikes. Odesu recalls that he and Woo Jin were high school mates back in the day, and that he'd witnessed Woo Jin committing incest with his sister at the time. Their fellow students learned about it, rumors spread, and Woo Jin's sister killed herself, leading her grief-stricken brother to pledge revenge. Woo Jin hypnotized Odesu and Mido, orchestrating their meeting and priming them to fall in love, so that Odesu would experience the same pain of incest that he did. Park Chan-wook stated that he named the main character Odesu to remind the viewer of Oedipus. In addition to the theme of unknown incest being revealed, the character of Oedipus gouges his eyes out to avoid seeing a world that hates the truth, while Odesu cuts off his tongue to avoid speaking a truth he has come to despise. Oedipus was a tragic hero in Greek mythology who accidentally fulfilled a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, thereby bringing disaster to his city and family. The story is the subject of Sophocles' tragedy Oedipus Rex, representing enduring themes of Greek myth and drama, the flawed nature of humanity, and an individual's role in the course of destiny within a harsh universe. During the 19th century in Vienna, a certain Sigmund Freud attended a performance of Sophocles' play and was later inspired to develop the idea of the Oedipus complex in his burgeoning psychoanalytic theory about a child's unconscious sexual desire for the opposite-sex parent and hatred for the same-sex parent. In his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, first published in 1899, Freud proposed that an Oedipal desire is a universal phenomenon innate to human beings and the cause of much unconscious guilt. He spoke of Oedipus as having a tragic destiny that moves us because his fate might very well have been ours. The oracle laid the same curse upon us before our birth as upon Oedipus. Perhaps it is the fate of all of us, Freud claimed, to direct our first sexual impulse towards our mother and our first murderous hatred against our father. I would argue that this is just one scenario among many possible outcomes in the so-called family romance of our formative years. We are inducted into the world by our primary caregivers, and their attitudes towards sexuality have an effect on the development of our own eroticism. But this is not something that the public discourse permits so readily because, well, it's super awkward, man. It's a topic that occupies an ambivalent space because it is forbidden, making it a prime Freudian preoccupation. Ain't it always the way? Oldboy is daring because it faces the incest taboo in an experientially compelling way. The truth of the blood relation between the men in the story and their respective love interests, a sister and a daughter, remains hidden for the majority of the film and produces an overwhelmingly violent reaction upon discovery. Incest remains a taboo in modern societies, yet it is a delicate impulse and primitive urge that in our fantasy life is not always so easy to repress. A cursory search on pornography websites makes that patently clear, with so much X-rated content predicated on sexual intercourse between family members. Freud wrote extensively about the emotional ambivalence around taboo practices. He explained taboo as something that is prevented by society without reason, that a taboo does not spontaneously exist. At one point in human history, the taboo had meaning, but the significance has since been lost to time. Taboo is seen as something dangerous and having dire consequences, but no one really knows why. The mere mention of the impulse produces too much guilt at the individual level and too much shame at the social level. It has been this way for such a long time that the original implications of the taboo are no longer traceable. The narrative structure of Oldboy hinges on the suppression of the incest taboo. A direct confrontation with the impulse is not permitted, so it has to be expressed in a covert way. The symbolism of long-term imprisonment, only to be released and immediately step right into the snare of taboo, paints a topographical picture of repression, making the forbidden object even more appealing than it had been originally. That's why I think it's most interesting to read Oldboy purely allegorically, as a cautionary tale against rendering certain topics unspeakable, against deplatforming aspects of society and within our own psyche, however unpalatable they may be, because it's a surefire way of making them even more enthralling and therefore more precarious. The Oedipal significance of Oldboy is powerful in the way that Greek myths always remind us. We cannot escape the destiny of our impulses. These stories are classified as tragedy precisely because we make concerted efforts to deny our own capacity to produce inappropriate fantasies, only for the secret wish to take up even more space in the unconscious mind anyway. Of course, this is not to suggest that we ought to follow every illicit desire to its logical conclusion. Rather, the psychoanalytic aim is to acknowledge the disturbing material in an honest way, thereby diminishing its hold through the process of interpretation. Park Chan-wook's films pave a way into that, bridging an imaginary gap that never ceases to be terrifying, yet generates a sense of catharsis when we engage with the very thing that bothers us so much. Till next time.
A big thank you there to the amazing Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's takes on classic genre movies, then you can listen to her podcast that she hosts with Sarah Cleaver, the Projections podcast. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And for any information on any of Mary's upcoming courses, then please do check her out on Twitter. Follow her there at PsychStar. Okay, Tim, I think we're going to wrap things up. There is so much more we could say about these movies, but we're going to have to cut it off. But thank you so much. My final question for you, Tim, is, you know, when it comes to this warped, strange genre of mind and body, what's your favourite? What's your favourite body horror?
Well, this is the question. I guess I would probably have to say it's either going to be Audition or Martyrs by Pascal Laugier, which is obviously a very grueling film in its own right.
You've got dark tastes in your horror.
Well, or do I? I mean, this isn't a Martyrs conversation. You know, I look forward to that episode when it comes out. But I think like Martyrs as well, like it goes to some horrible places, much like Audition and Oldboy does. But there is an ambiguity to the ending, which is open to like multiple different readings. And I think some of those readings are not as bleak as others. And I certainly take some stuff from it, which I think is, again, a bit like Audition, is quite transcendental almost. It kind of goes to places which are so beyond what a lot of Western cinema does. I mean, I know obviously like France is part of the West, but, you know, like English speaking cinema, perhaps.
Yes.
And I think it's an absolutely remarkable film. Very, very difficult to watch, of course. It's one of those films that I remember pausing halfway through to check how long I had to endure it for, because I was like, I don't know how much more I could take. But then when you get to the end, it's really a piece of work. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it truly is. I'm kind of terrified / excited to watch it for a second. I've only seen it once, and that was about 10 years ago when it was first out. And I'm finally gearing up to give it a second watch for the podcast. It's going to be really something. Tim, thank you so much for this. It's been so much fun. Just remind us where people can find you and find more stuff that you've written and more of your work out there online.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I freelance for Total Film magazine. So in these trying COVID times, times, support film magazines, buy Total Film.
Absolutely.
You can follow me on Twitter at Fats Coleman, FATSCOLEMAN, or I run my own genre site, movingpicturesfilmclub.com.
Love it. Tim, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, man. Take care.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Tim Coleman. God, what a fountain of knowledge that guy is. It was such a treat to sit down and chat about these two incredibly challenging movies with somebody as clever and informed as Tim Coleman. So a big thank you once again to Tim. So I would love to hear what your thoughts on these movies are. Please do get in touch. What do you think of Oldboy, and what do you think of Audition? The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's films and anything else horror related with fellow listeners, then join our discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. If you want to support this podcast to become a sponsor or simply to get weekly bonus episodes, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can donate at either a $3, $5, $10, or $20 per month level and get different benefits accordingly. You can find all previous episodes and seasons of this podcast on our website, evolutionofhorror.com. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, Acast, Libsyn, and Spotify. If you want to support this podcast but can't afford to do so financially, we would be hugely grateful if you would spare a few minutes just to leave us a rating and review, preferably a positive one, on Apple Podcasts. We'd be really grateful, as that helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay then, onwards and upwards to part 23. Next week is going to be the last episode of 2020. Our Christmas special, I guess you might want to call it. One of the two films is, I guess you could call a Christmas horror film, so that's something. But next week, these are not two films for the faint-hearted, because next week we are heading from Asia over to France, and we are talking about the world of new French extremity. Next week, I'm going to be joined by French writer and critic Eleanor Lazic, and she's joining me to discuss Trouble Every Day from 2001 and Inside from 2007. Whew. Merry Christmas, everyone. Join us next week for all of that and more on the Evolution of Horror.